We spend our lives holding on to people, to things, to memories, expectations, identities, as if clutching tighter could stop the world from changing, as if refusing to let go could somehow protect us from pain. But here's the quiet truth we rarely want to admit. Nothing stays, not love, not youth, not even the body we call our own. And yet we hold. Why? Why does letting go feel like losing a limb? Why does surrendering seem like weakness when it's often the only way to truly be free? Maybe it's because we've been taught that to let go is to give up, to stop caring, to walk away. But Buddhism doesn't see it that way. In fact, in the teachings of the Buddha, letting go is not defeat, it is liberation. Imagine this, you're carrying a heavy bag. At first it's fine, manageable. You convince yourself, I've got this. But hours pass, your hands ache, your shoulders tighten. You keep walking until finally you can't anymore. Now tell me, does putting the bag down mean you're weak or wise? Letting go is like that. It's not about giving up. It's about knowing when carrying something no longer serves you. But here's the thing, we don't just hold physical things. We carry grudges, old versions of ourselves, unspoken dreams that still echo in our chest at midnight. We hold on to control, to needing to be right, to the illusion that if we just try harder, love harder, work harder, we can make life go our way. And yet life doesn't work like that. It flows like a river. And the more we try to dam it, the more it slips through our fingers. Buddhism calls this craving T a letter 1E47HA macron, a thirst that never ends. It's the mind saying more, mine, forever. But everything is impermanent. Even the me we try so hard to protect. Letting go, then, isn't a passive act. It's not about walking away from life. It's about meeting life exactly as it is without needing to grip it so tightly. There's a quiet power in that. Think of the lotus flower. It doesn't force its way through the mud. It rises slowly, silently through the dark waters and blooms, not because it clung, but because it let nature take its course. This is the path of renunciation. Not as denial, but as clarity. A letting go that comes from understanding, not from fear. But fear, yes, it's real. We fear losing what we love. We fear being alone. We fear becoming no one. So we hold on even to what hurts. Because familiarity feels safer than freedom. Because at least when we suffer, we know who we are. But Buddhism whispers something else. Something radical, something freeing. You are not your pain, you are not your story, and you are not diminished by release. You are made lighter by it. Letting go doesn't erase love, it deepens it. It allows us to love without possession, to care without control, to live without being chained to outcomes we cannot dictate. A parent learns to let go when their child takes their first step into the world. A monk lets go of identity to touch the stillness beneath. And each of us in our quietest moments knows there is something beautiful on the other side of surrender. Still, letting go isn't something we master in a day. It's a practice, a process, sometimes a heartbreak. It may begin with a single breath, a silent recognition that maybe, just maybe, it's time to loosen your grip. Not because you don't care, but because you're ready to care differently, more freely, more fully, more truthfully. You see, the illusion of holding on is that it gives us power, but the reality, it often gives us pain. And the moment we begin to see this, not just with our minds but with our hearts, we begin to awaken to something quieter than craving, deeper than fear, more spacious than self. We begin to glimpse what the Buddha meant when he said, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." This isn't the kind of message we hear often, not in a world that celebrates hustling, owning, achieving. But renunciation in Buddhism was never about escaping life. It's about embracing it fully without being owned by it. It's not about turning away, it's about turning inward. And from that still place, living outwardly with more grace. There is a silence behind all our striving, a stillness that doesn't need to prove, possess, or pretend. And maybe, just maybe, that stillness has been waiting for you, patiently, gently, waiting for the moment you're ready to stop clutching and start living. Sometimes the greatest strength is found not in holding on, but in the sacred art of letting go. When we hear the word renunciation, most of us picture the same scene. A monk in saffron robes, sitting silently beneath a tree far from the noise of the world. We imagine mountains, monasteries, a vow of silence, a bowl in hand, a world left behind. But what if renunciation has nothing to do with where you are, and everything to do with how you relate to the world? What if renunciation isn't about escaping life, but about engaging it with a different kind of heart? Because let's be honest, you can shave your head, wear the robes, leave behind your job, your house, your name, and still carry inside you all the same fears, attachments, and desires you hope to escape. The Buddha didn't teach renunciation as a costume. He taught it as a liberation, a shift so profound it changes how you see everything. To renounce doesn't mean to reject. It means to release, to see the glittering distractions of the world for what they are, temporary, empty, fleeting, and to stop chasing them like they can make us whole. It means looking directly at desire and saying, "I see you, but I am no longer fooled by you." That's the beginning of real freedom. In Pali, the word is nekkhamma, not just physical renunciation, but mental renunciation. Not just stepping away from the world, but stepping out of the grip it has on your mind. Because what keeps us bound is not the world itself, it's the way we cling to it. We don't suffer because of money or love or ambition. We suffer because we attach to these things, as if they can give us a permanent identity, as if they'll never leave us, as if they define our worth. But the truth, everything we grasp eventually slips through our hands. There's a story from the Buddha's life that says more than 1,000 scriptures. One day, a young man approached the Buddha and said, "I want to follow you. I want to renounce the world. Teach me how to let go." The Buddha looked at him and smiled, and instead of giving him a list of things to abandon, he simply said, "Let go of what doesn't belong to you." The young man was confused. "But I own nothing," he said. "I've already given up everything, my home, my family, my possessions." And the Buddha replied, "Then let go of your thoughts, let go of your anger, let go of your pride. These are the things that never belong to you, yet you carry them every day." That is renunciation. It's not about fleeing the world. It's about seeing clearly, living lightly, and loving without chains. It's being able to sit in traffic without losing your peace, to hear harsh words without needing to defend your ego, to succeed without becoming greedy, to love without controlling, to give without needing something in return. This is what the Buddha meant when he said the householder too can walk the path, if their heart is free. In that way, renunciation doesn't begin on a mountain. It begins in a moment, the moment you choose awareness over habit, the moment you pause before reacting, the moment you forgive instead of fight, the moment you say, "I don't need this to be happy." It begins the first time you see a craving rise, and instead of following it, you bow to it, you smile, you let it pass. There's nothing glamorous about true renunciation. No praise, no spotlight. No gold star for walking away from ego again and again in the quiet corners of your life. But that's exactly where the most powerful kind of renunciation lies. In the unnoticed, everyday moments where you choose freedom over fear. It's when you let someone else speak first, when you apologize first, when you feel the need to prove you're right but you don't. It's subtle, it's internal, and it's transformative. We often think freedom means having more. But Buddhism teaches the opposite. Freedom is needing less, not because you're denying yourself, but because your joy is no longer tied to the outcome. When you renounce attachment, you don't lose the world. You rediscover it. You taste life without grasping. You feel love without ownership. You breathe it without needing the next moment to be different. That's not deprivation. That's awakening. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, when your mind spins with craving or fear, pause, ask yourself, what am I holding that I don't need? What can I release right now, not out of weakness, but from a place of strength? Renunciation isn't dramatic, it's a whisper, a breath, a soft opening of the hand, and when the hand opens, so does the heart. It's in these small surrenders that great awakenings begin, not in faraway temples, not only in silence, but right here, in the sacred ordinariness of your life. And somewhere along the way, you'll realize you didn't have to run away to renounce. You just had to remember what was never really yours to begin with. Start so innocently, We find something we love, a person, a dream, an idea, and we wrap our hearts around it. We call it ours. We feed it with attention, time, expectation. We protect it. We plan our lives around it. And without even realizing it, we begin to grip, not with hands, but with the mind. And that is where the suffering begins. Attachment doesn't look like suffering at first. It looks like passion, like purpose, like love. It whispers, "This is what makes life meaningful. This is what makes you whole." But behind that beautiful surface, a quiet fear starts to form. What if I lose this? What if they change? What if it slips away? And so we grip tighter, not because we're ungrateful, but because we're terrified. Terrified of the void we believe will be left behind. The Buddha saw this clearly. In the second noble truth, he named it T, a letter 1E47H, a macron, craving, the thirst that fuels suffering. Not just desire, but clinging, and clinging has many forms. We cling to pleasure, to being liked, to status, to identity, to being seen a certain way, to needing life to go our way, but life doesn't follow our plans, and so we suffer. Imagine holding a rope tied to a moving train. The tighter you hold, the more it drags you, cuts into your palms, throws you off balance. Now here's the paradox. We think letting go means falling. But often, it's the clinging that's hurting us, not the thing itself. We don't suffer because people leave. We suffer because we believe they never would. We don't suffer because things change. We suffer because we expected them to stay the same. Attachment whispers, "You need this to be happy." But what if that voice is lying? There's a story from the Zen tradition. A monk walks with his student through a forest. They come to a river where a woman is struggling to cross. The monk gently lifts her, carries her across, and sets her down. Hours later, the student, clearly agitated, says, "Master, monks are not supposed to touch women. Why did you carry her?" The master smiles. "I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" That is the clinging mind. We don't just carry experiences. We carry the stories we create around them. We replay them, analyze them, twist them into self-made suffering. Attachment doesn't just bind us to pleasure, it binds us to pain. Think about a grudge. How long have you carried one? Days, years, decades, and each time it surfaces, it wounds you again. Not because the person is still hurting you, but because you never let go. In Buddhism, attachment is not love. Love is spacious. Love allows. Love gives room to grow, to leave, to return, or not. Attachment is possessive. It says, "You belong to me." It says, "Don't change," but everything changes. So attachment becomes a prison, both for the one who's held and the one who's holding. But here's the beautiful part. The mind that clings can also release. It's not about rejecting everything. It's about relating to things differently. A flower is beautiful, but you don't need to pluck it to enjoy it. A moment is precious, but you don't need to hold it forever. You can fully experience life and let it pass. That's not detachment. That's freedom. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop suffering over what you can't control. It means loving without fear, working without obsession, dreaming without desperation. It means being in the world, but not owned by it. And yes, it's hard. We've been taught to chase, to attach, to define ourselves by what we possess. But what if we started asking, what am I clinging to right now? Is it making me more free or more fearful? If I loosen my grip, even just a little, what opens up inside me? There is a peace that only reveals itself when the grasping stops, a lightness, a quiet joy, and once you taste it, you'll wonder why you ever carried so much for so long, because the mind that clings is heavy, but the heart that releases, that heart is free. And maybe now we're ready to explore something even deeper. Not just what we're attached to, but what we think we are. Because beyond all the things we cling to, there is one thing we hold onto most tightly of all, the self. We live in a world that glorifies control. Control your future. Control your brand. Control your emotions. Control your outcome. Control everything, or risk being seen as weak, lost, or left behind. But what if the deepest strength isn't found in control, but in the quiet willingness to let go? You see, we've been taught a dangerous idea, that letting go means giving up, that surrender means failure, that those who walk away are somehow not strong enough to stay. But the Dharma teaches something radically different. Letting go is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is power. It is courage of the highest kind. Think of the mighty tree in a storm. It survives not by resisting the wind, but by bending with it, by knowing when to yield. Or think of water, gentle, formless, always flowing. Yet it carves canyons. It wears down stone. It finds its way through anything, not by force, but by surrender. That is the kind of strength the Buddha spoke of. There's a story. A man comes to the Buddha overwhelmed by grief. He had lost his only child. With tears in his eyes, he asks, "Why is life so cruel? Why did this happen to me?" The Buddha listens, calm, open, silent. Then he says gently, "I cannot take away your pain, but I can show you the path that leads beyond it." The man looks confused. How? And the Buddha replies, "By letting go not of love, but of the illusion that anything in this world can be held forever." That's the kind of power we're talking about here. Not the power to change the world, but the power to stop letting the world change you, to face loss without collapsing, to feel pain without becoming it, to be hurt but still open. This isn't passive. This isn't apathy. This is the strength of deep presence, of being with life as it is. It takes strength to hold on, yes, but it takes greater strength to release something. When every part of you wants to keep clinging, it takes strength to walk away from resentment. When revenge feels sweeter, it takes strength to forgive. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. It takes strength to admit, "This no longer serves me," and to bow out not with bitterness, but with quiet dignity. But here's the thing. Letting go doesn't always come with trumpets. It's not dramatic. It's not a big speech. It doesn't need to be announced. True letting go is subtle, private, silent. It happens in the quiet shift of a single breath, in the softening of the shoulders, in the moment you stop replaying the past, in the moment you stop needing to prove you're right, in the moment you choose peace over pride. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha says, "Just as a snake sheds its old skin, so too does the wise person let go of old habits, views, and attachments." The snake doesn't mourn the skin it sheds. It simply moves on, because it has outgrown what no longer fits. What if you've outgrown something too? A role, a belief, a fear, a version of yourself you no longer need to be. This is the essence of renunciation, not the loud renunciation of walking away from the world, but the silent renunciation of old patterns within. When you let go, you don't become less. You become more whole, more rooted, more still, more free. The world may not see it. They may say, "You've changed. You've lost your fire. You're not who you used to be." And they'd be right. Because the path of awakening isn't about being who you used to be. It's about becoming who you really are, beneath all the layers of proving, pleasing, and pretending. Letting go doesn't erase your story. It reclaims it. It allows you to live not from fear, but from truth. It's the quiet decision to stop grasping at what you cannot control and finally come home to what you can. Your breath, your awareness, your compassion, your freedom. And when that begins to unfold, you'll notice something powerful. The more you let go, the more space opens up inside you, space for stillness, space for joy, space for love that doesn't cling, space for kind of power the world doesn't understand, but your soul remembers. So the next time someone tells you, letting go is weak, just smile, because deep down you'll know the truth. Letting go is strength in its purest form, a strength so quiet it can only be heard in silence. But if letting go is such a strength, why do we so often confuse it with indifference? Why does non-attachment feel at times like we're losing our humanity? To answer that, we have to step into the heart and rediscover the love that's born not from clinging, but from letting go. It's easy to talk about letting go when you're sitting on a mountaintop, eyes closed, breath slow, the world a distant hum. But what about here? In the noise, in the rush, in the messiness of ordinary life, what does renunciation look like? Without the robe, without the monastery, without leaving everything behind. The Buddha never asked everyone to become monks. He didn't say freedom was reserved for those who live in caves. He offered the path to all, to farmers, merchants, mothers, kings, to those who lived with their hands in the world, but didn't let the world own their hearts. Because real renunciation doesn't happen just on the cushion. It happens in the kitchen, in traffic, in conversations that test your patience. In the subtle moment, you choose compassion instead of control. To live without attachment doesn't mean we abandon our responsibilities. It means we show up fully, but without clinging to how things must be. It's when you work hard, but let go of needing to succeed. It's when you love deeply, but don't chain your joy to someone else's behavior. It's when you help others, without needing to be recognized. Let's make it real. You're in a conversation, someone criticizes you. Your instinct is to defend, to prove, to push back. But you pause, you feel the tightness rise in your chest, the urge to be right. And instead of reacting, you release. You let go of needing to win, needing to look good, needing to have the last word. And you simply listen. That is renunciation. That is inner mastery. You're at work. A project you poured your heart into fails. You feel frustration, disappointment, maybe shame. But instead of spiraling into blame or self-pity, you take a breath. You remember this moment is not who you are. Success is not your identity. Failure is not your prison. You let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because your peace matters more. That is living without attachment. There's a saying in the Dhammapada, just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame. That's not because they don't care. It's because they've learned something deeper. You can be fully engaged in life without being enslaved by it. Even joy becomes lighter when you stop gripping it. You hold your child. You feel your love pouring out like sunlight, and still somewhere in you a quiet knowing arises. I cannot keep this moment, but I can be here for all of it without fear, without needing it to last. That is the beauty of non-attachment, not detachment, not numbness, but a love that holds with open hands. Letting go in daily life also means letting go of control. You've planned your day, everything is set. Then life happens. The car breaks down, someone cancels. You spill coffee on your white shirt. The mind resists. This shouldn't be happening. This ruins everything. But what if it doesn't? What if you let go of the idea that things must go your way, and instead meet life as it is? That surrender is not passivity. It's participation without friction. It's flowing with life, not fighting it. Even the most ordinary tasks become sacred when done without clinging. Washing dishes, folding laundry, walking to the store. Each is an opportunity to practice. Awareness without agenda, effort without tension, presence without grasping. This is how renunciation becomes alive, not in grand gestures, but in subtle shifts, not in escape, but in deep engagement. There's a story of a layperson who asked a monk, "Can someone like me living in the world really walk the path?" The monk smiled and said, "It depends not on where you live, but on where your heart is tethered. You can be surrounded by noise and still be rooted in stillness. You can have a family, a job, 1,000 responsibilities, and still live each day from a place of non-attachment, compassion, and clarity." Renunciation in action is not the rejection of life. It is the embrace of life without clinging. It is walking through the world with your hands open, not to grab, but to give, to serve, to love, to let things come and go without losing yourself in the process. You don't have to leave your home to live like this. You don't need to abandon your dreams. You just need to loosen the grip so that your joy isn't chained to outcomes, so that your heart stays soft even when life gets hard. And in that softness, you'll find something unshakable. But of course, there's a danger here. When we begin to let go, some people may think we've stopped caring, that we've become cold, distant, indifferent, but they don't see what's really happening inside. Because the heart that lets go is often the heart that feels more deeply than ever before. Some people hear the word non-attachment and imagine a cold, distant life, like a monk in a cave. Untouched by joy, unmoved by pain, immune to love. They ask, if I let go, will I stop caring? If I release my grip, will I become numb? But what they don't realize is that non-attachment doesn't close the heart, it opens it, wider than ever. You see, indifference is the absence of feeling. It turns away, it shrugs, it says, "That's not my problem." But non-attachment, it turns towards suffering, not to fix, not to control, but to be truly present with it. When you're attached, you love with fear, you care with conditions, you give but with invisible strings. If you hurt, I hurt. If you change, I panic. If you leave, I break. That's not compassion, that's possession in disguise, but the love that arises from non-attachment. It's a flame that warms without burning. It holds without gripping. It gives without keeping score. It sees people not as extensions of our ego, but as fellow travelers on this wild, fleeting path of life. True compassion doesn't say, I need you to be okay so I can feel at peace. It says, even if you're not okay, I will sit with you here, without needing to fix, without needing to run. It's the quiet strength to witness pain without being drowned in it. It's the softness that stays, not because it has to, but because it wants to, with no reward expected. There's a story of the Buddha encountering a grieving mother. She had lost her child. She was broken, desperate, clinging to hope like a drowning woman to driftwood. She begged the Buddha to bring her child back. He didn't lecture her. He didn't offer empty words. He simply said, "Bring me a mustard seed from a house untouched by death." She went door to door. Every family had lost someone, and slowly, gently, her grip on the illusion of permanence began to loosen. She returned, not cured, but awakened. That is compassion rooted in non-attachment, offering truth, offering presence, without needing to rescue. Non-attachment is what allows us to be with another's suffering, without being destroyed by it. It lets us love without turning love into a cage. It lets us care without turning care into control. It is the freedom to say, I am here for you, but I do not own you. In parenting, this is the love that allows a child to grow, not to mold them into who we think they should be, but to guide them. Then let them fly. In friendship, it's the space to speak truth, even if it risks discomfort. In grief, it's the strength to let tears flow, without drowning in sorrow's undertow. In helping others, it's the knowing, I do this from love, not from the need to be needed. Some think compassion requires emotional overwhelm. They mistake burnout for care, but true compassion is clear, grounded, still, like a mountain that holds the storms, without collapsing. Non-attachment is the root that keeps compassion from being uprooted by every gust of emotion. So when someone you love is suffering, don't try to erase their pain, just be with them, without clinging, without fixing. When life disappoints, don't shut down, stay open, soft, unattached but unafraid to feel. This is the paradox. The less you cling, the deeper you can love. To love without attachment is not to love less. It's to love purely. Not I love you because you complete me, but I love you because you are. Not I care because I want something in return, but I care because your suffering touches the same stream of life that flows through me. This is the love that awakens, not entangles. There's a reason the Buddha's face is so calm, not empty, but vast. In his stillness, there is room for all beings. He didn't numb himself to pain. He embraced it, understood it, held it gently, without clinging to outcomes. That's the heart of true compassion, and it's available to all of us. Right here, right now, in every choice we make. When we stop confusing attachment with love, when we stop mistaking control for care, our hearts become soft again. And in that softness, we find our greatest strength. But what happens when we truly release the need to possess anything at all? What happens when we start to find joy not in holding, but in flowing? Maybe, just maybe, freedom begins to bloom. There's a kind of letting go that doesn't just change your day, it changes you. You see, we can release possessions, detach from people, expectations, outcomes. But as long as we're still clutching that one silent thing, that little voice whispering me, mine, I, we're still tangled in the root of suffering. This is the final letting go, the surrender of ego, and it's the hardest of all. The ego is clever. It doesn't wear a name tag. It hides in your achievements, in your wounds, in your opinions, your spiritual identity, even your desire to let go. It says, I'm a good person. I'm awakened. I'm right. I've suffered more than others. It always wants a story, a role, a reason to be the center of the stage. And here's the trap. Even when we're trying to be humble, the ego can be proud of that too. But the Dharma is clear. As long as there is a self to defend, there will be suffering to endure. This doesn't mean we disappear or that we become nothing. It means we stop clinging to the illusion that this I is fixed, permanent, separate. Think about this. The body changes. The thoughts change. The emotions rise and fall like tides. Even your memories are not you. They are stories recorded by a brain that won't last. So, what exactly are you holding on to? Who is this I you're so busy protecting? Surrendering the ego isn't a dramatic act. It's not loud. It's not violent. It's quiet. Like a leaf finally letting go of the branch and floating freely on the wind. It doesn't fight, it flows. The Buddha didn't awaken by adding more knowledge. He awakened by subtracting illusion, layer by layer, until all that was left was clarity. The kind of clarity that sees without judging, loves without clinging, and acts without needing recognition. You might be wondering, if I let go of the ego, will there be anything left of me? Yes, but it won't be the me you're used to. It'll be the part of you that's always been free. Beneath the noise, beneath the roles, beneath the masks, the one who simply is, not the thinker of thoughts, but the witness of them, not the doer, but the presence within the doing. When you surrender the ego, you stop needing to win arguments. You stop needing applause. You stop fearing failure, because none of it touches who you truly are. You become a clear mirror, reflecting everything, holding on to nothing. You become the sky, not the passing weather, and from that place, real peace begins, not the peace of a perfect life, but the peace of no longer needing perfection, not the joy of everything going your way, but the joy of no longer needing it to. Letting go of the ego is not erasing yourself. It's remembering that you were never just this name, this body, this past. It's remembering that your deepest nature has no borders, no limits, no need to be someone when you already are everything. Somewhere deep inside, you already know this truth. It's why you feel a strange relief when you stop defending yourself. It's why in moments of awe under a starry sky, by the ocean, in deep meditation, the I disappears and all that's left is being. That's not loss, that's liberation. There's nothing wrong with having an ego. It's part of being human, but don't let it drive the car. Don't let it speak for your soul. When we surrender the ego, we don't become less. We become real. And in that realness, love is no longer needy. Joy is no longer fragile. Peace is no longer far. Now imagine a world where people stopped defending their egos and started listening from silence. Imagine what it would feel like to meet others not from your masks but from your being. No performance, no judgment, just presence. That's not a dream. That's the next step. Because once the ego steps aside, something else rises, stillness, clarity, truth. And from that soil, the deepest wisdom begins to bloom. Freedom, it's a word we all crave. But rarely do we stop to ask, freedom from what? We chase careers, possessions, relationships, reputation, hoping they'll make us feel free. But more often than not, they tie us up in invisible knots, not because they're bad, but because we cling, and where there is clinging, there is no space to breathe. But the moment you let go, truly let go, not out of force or frustration, but out of clarity, a shift happens. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's real. You feel it in your chest, a lightness, a release, a kind of quiet joy that needs no reason to be there. This is the fruit of renunciation, not exile, not emptiness, but freedom. You see, true letting go isn't about having less, it's about being less owned. When you're no longer owned by your cravings, your fears, your past, or the expectations of the world, you become spacious inside, like a wide open sky that holds everything but clings to nothing. And from that space, a strange and beautiful thing arises, gratitude, not the kind that needs conditions. Not I'm grateful because things went my way, but I'm grateful because I'm free. Even in difficulty, even in loss, even in the ordinary, because freedom isn't when nothing happens. It's when everything can happen and you remain untouched. When you let go, you become deeply present. You're not carrying the weight of what happened yesterday or the anxiety of what might come tomorrow. You're just here, fully, not rushing to get somewhere, not resisting where you are. And in that moment, life becomes enough. Simple, silent, sacred. Think of the monk with no possessions, walking barefoot through the world, his robe worn, his bowl empty, yet his smile unshakable. Why? Because he's not full of things, he's full of peace. And what about you? You don't need to wear robes. You don't need to live in a forest. You just need to ask, what am I clinging to that is costing me my peace? And when you see it, gently loosen your grip. Letting go is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a choice, not to react, not to chase, not to prove, just to breathe and be. And that too is renunciation. You see, the fruit of letting go isn't something you wait for. It's something that arises the moment you release, like unclenching your fist and feeling the tension melt, like dropping a heavy bag and realizing you never needed it. You don't have to wait years for peace. You just have to stop carrying what was never yours to begin with. And once you've tasted that peace, once you've felt what it's like to walk lightly in this heavy world, you'll never want to go back, not because life gets easier, but because you get lighter. You no longer live to escape your suffering. You live with a heart that knows how not to create more. That's the fruit. And from that fruit comes compassion, not pity, not martyrdom, but the kind of love that expects nothing back because it's already full. When you're no longer ruled by ego, you're no longer loving to feel worthy. You're loving because that's what freedom does. It gives, it shares, it uplifts, without clinging to the outcome. Letting go doesn't mean you give up on life. It means you finally join it. You stop swimming upstream. You start flowing with the current. And in that flow, you discover something far deeper than control: trust. Trust in impermanence, trust in the unfolding, trust that life in its mysterious rhythm knows what it's doing even when you don't. And in that trust, you stop needing to grasp. You stop needing to fight. You start walking with life instead of against it. When you let go, you don't shrink, you expand. You become vast, open, free, not because you have nothing, but because nothing has you. That's the fruit. And once it ripens in your heart, no one can take it away. But there's still one question left, one final layer of renunciation that most people never see. What happens when we're faced with the ultimate loss, our own death? Can we let go even then? Or is that the final fear we all avoid? Let's go there. Letting go is not a single act. It's not a spiritual trophy you earn once and then move on. It's a practice, a rhythm, a flow, a returning like waves meeting the shore again and again. You release, you return, you release, you return, each time just a little more lightly, a little more freely, a little more knowingly. You let go once and you feel peace. So you think, I've done it. But then life comes with its sharp corners, its sweet promises, its subtle hooks, and you realize attachment wears many masks. Sometimes it's the need to be understood. Sometimes it's the fear of being alone. Sometimes it's that tiny thread of pride that says, I know better. And just like that, you're holding on again, but this time even more quietly. That's why the path isn't about perfection, it's about practice. A constant returning to center, to stillness, to surrender. It's brushing your ego off like dust, not once a year, but every morning when you wake up. It's noticing when your heart clenches and gently inviting it to soften again. No drama, no shame. Just this simple, sacred work, unclenching again and again. In Zen, they say, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. What changes is not the world, but how you meet it. You still live, still love, still lose, but you don't cling the same way. You hold everything like you're holding a butterfly, with care, but not control. And when it flies away, you smile, because you were never trying to keep it, only to honor it while it stayed. Letting go isn't the enemy of love, it's the condition for true love, because love that clings is suffocating. Love that controls is fear in disguise, but love that lets go, that simply allows, is the most generous thing in the universe. And it only comes when we've practiced releasing, again and again. There will be days when you forget, days when the old habits return, when the ego speaks louder, when fear tightens its grip. That's okay. Even the most seasoned practitioner has to begin again 100 times a day. Each time is not failure. Each time is the practice. Even in forgetting, you are learning. Even in holding on, you are being shown what still needs to be released. This is not a race. This is a rhythm. Sometimes letting go is loud, like quitting a toxic job or walking away from a relationship that's long since died. But more often, it's quiet. It's sitting in silence and noticing. There it is again, the need to be right, and just breathing it out. It's feeling the rise of impatience and choosing instead to wait. It's seeing your mind try to rewrite the past and gently whispering, let it go. No applause, no lightning bolt, just another drop of wisdom falling into the still pool of your being. And every time you let go, something beautiful happens, not something you can post, not something the world will praise, but something real. You become just a little lighter, a little softer, a little more grounded in truth. You start seeing life not as a possession, but as a gift, not as something to conquer, but as something to receive. And that's when life begins to dance with you, not as your opponent, but as your partner. The practice of letting go isn't linear. Some days you feel like you've made it, that you've left the old patterns behind, and then something small, a word, a memory, a moment, brings it all rushing back. That's not regression, that's revealing. The path deepens not by escaping the knots, but by meeting them more patiently each time. You let go, not to avoid life, but to meet it fully. The more you practice, the less you need to hold. And the less you hold, the more space you have for wonder, for stillness, for love. You become like an open field, nothing to guard, nothing to defend, just presence, just being. That's the quiet power of letting go again and again. And as you continue to release each thought, each fear, each story, you're not becoming less. You're becoming more whole. You're returning, not to some ideal version of yourself, but to what was always there underneath the clinging, still, simple, unshakable. But there is one last piece to this journey, a final unfolding. What happens when you no longer resist any part of life? When letting go becomes your natural state, not just something you do, but something you are. Let's bring it all together. We often think letting go is about losing control, losing people, losing meaning. But what if letting go is actually about loving more deeply? When you truly let go, you stop trying to possess the world. You begin to see it clearly, as it is, fragile, fleeting, and beautiful. You stop clutching to outcomes and begin honoring the present. You stop needing people to fit your expectations, and instead, you cherish them in their full imperfection. Letting go doesn't close your heart, it opens it. Because only when your hands are empty can you receive the truth. Only when you stop holding so tightly can you finally feel the subtle softness of life, the warmth of a breeze, the pause in a conversation, the silent look from someone you love. These small, sacred moments pass right through us when we're clinging. But when you let go, you begin to truly see. Letting go is not abandoning love. It is loving without conditions, without control, without fear, without needing to be repaid. Just love as it is. And when your whole life becomes this practice of release, you no longer fight the flow of existence. You move with it. Even grief becomes sacred. Even loss becomes an offering. You don't harden, you soften. You don't hide from pain, you hold it gently. Then let it pass. The world doesn't need more people who cling. It needs more people who can love without grasping, who can hold life like water with open hands. That's the gift of letting go. Not escape, not numbness, but a profound presence and a deeper, quieter kind of love. So if you've walked this journey with me, if something in you has stirred, softened, opened, then perhaps you're already beginning to live in a new way where letting go is not something you do, but something you are. A quiet freedom, a deeper compassion, a lighter, truer way to walk the world. If this touched something in you, if even a single sentence felt like truth gently whispered to your soul, then I invite you to stay. Not because you need more content, but because you're walking this path too. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we explore teachings not to escape life, but to live it with depth, clarity, and presence. Let's walk gently together with open minds, soft hearts, and hands that know how to let go.